the text actually creates space for our skepticism. Part of the job of the evangelist and the preacher at Christmas time is communicate, yes, this is wondrous, but if this is true, and we believe it is, and there's very good reason for believing it is, this is worthy of your attention. Mary, as a young woman in the ancient world, is given agency. I find that fascinating. Rather than being a sort of sign of pagan compromise, this is an example of a theological reframing. God does exist, and he wants us to know he's there, and that's what Christmas is about.
A very warm welcome to the Lausanne Movement podcast for those who have the passion to accelerate global mission together. Every year at Christmas time, we tell the same story of angels and shepherds and a baby in a manger. But have we lost the wonder of what really happened and the chance to share why we believe it's true? I'm Jason Watson, and in this episode of the Lausanne Movement podcast, I sit down with Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, an author, theologian, and apologist, to explore the apologetics of Christmas. What makes the incarnation credible, compelling, and one of the greatest evangelistic opportunities of the year? Let's rediscover the wonder of Christmas together with Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. Well, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, it's great to have you with us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be joining you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So today we're going to be diving into the topic of Christmas. We're going to be releasing this podcast very close to Christmas itself, and really just tackling it from many different angles. But before we dive into it, I would love to hear a bit of your backstory. Tell us how you came to become passionate about apologetics and helping people discover Christ through the mind.
Yeah, thank you. I have a bit of a kind of international backstory. None of my parents weren't believers when I was born, and none of my grandparents were. My grandfather was a very committed atheist, raised my dad as an atheist. They had escaped from Soviet occupation after the Second World War and arrived in Britain as refugees. And then my parents met in Canada, and my dad taught at universities around the world, in America, here in the UK, and then in Australia. And I was actually born in Australia. And while they were there, my parents sort of had quite a dramatic encounter with Christ in their 30s. My dad actually had a vision of Jesus and experienced conviction of sin, which completely kind of turned his life around. And within a couple of years had felt a call into ministry, and had, particular sort of gifting towards evangelism and church planting. So we moved back to the UK when I was a young child, and my parents sort of ministered in different settings. When I was between the ages of 9 and 16, they were called to church plant in Britain's second largest city called Birmingham, which was an interesting and diverse city, but we were in a neighborhood that was nearly 80% Muslim, and the people there were mainly from a particular region of Pakistan, which later became a bit of a kind of recruiting ground for the Taliban. So it sort of shapes the type of Islamic community it was, if that makes sense. So I grew up in a setting where we were planting a church and seeing God move and seeing people come to faith from really, really diverse backgrounds. And I went to school in Britain, which means that you don't really have Christian friends unless you lead them to Christ. I mean, that was my experience. So what that meant, I think, was the need for apologetics. And I wouldn't have had the word apologetics. I wouldn't have known really what apologetics was. But just in the course of life and conversation and talking about faith and Jesus, questions, including really hostile questions, often came up. And it seemed to be something that I had an interest in and passion in. I ended up going to university in Oxford and having the opportunity to really study at a deeper level, but also experience more pushback on faith questions, and again, really needed apologetics there. And throughout my teenage years, I was also involved with YWAM's youth ministry, which was called King's Kids. And we used to go on 4 or 5 week mission trips in the summer. So I had the opportunity to kind of share the gospel cross-culturally, everywhere from Uzbekistan to Morocco to Prague, after the Berlin Wall came down. And so, yeah, apologetics became a little bit of I guess, a flavor through my experience of missions as well.
I love that, and I love hearing the backstory. I have a few more questions just about your story, if you don't mind us diving into that. One of the things I love chatting to pastors' kids and missionary kids about, especially if they're on the podcast, is just, there's often this trope that says, like, missionary kids or pastors' kids, they are always rebellious, and when I meet people like yourself who've grown up in homes that are come from ministry homes, I'd love to find out just like what it was that your parents did right, how you came to faith in your own way, and like move from a secondhand faith of your parents to choosing Christ for yourself. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's such an important question. I think for me, one of the distinctives was actually the life of the mind. So obviously my dad in particular was academically gifted and had, worked in academia before being a Christian. And so I think quite naturally then, in his own Christian faith, and then in the overflow of how we were raised as young people, there was this expectation that we wrestle with questions, and that we don't just necessarily accept everything at face value. So that would be one of the things. Like often where I see deconstruction amongst kids of leaders, there's been a sort of anti-intellectualism in the home. Don't watch that, don't read that, like live in this bubble, just accept everything and do what we say and be compliant, and an equation with compliance with faith, which, is a huge mistake. I think the second thing was that, God was so real because they were, the way they were living was in radical abandonment to him. And we were seeing people converted and, God breaking through into lives, healings, all sorts of things. And so I had an experience of the reality of God. And my parents certainly were not perfect, but they were not inauthentic. There was a reality to, they were super over the top in many ways. We kind of joke about it, but there was a connection to the living God and an expectation that God is actually God. And so that was wonderful. And then I think the third thing was, one of the strands that I really remember growing up was a concern for the suffering church. And I think that was partly because of our family backstory of escape from Eastern Europe and, communism. But because of that, or for whatever reason, in our family devotions, we really thought about and prayed for suffering Christians. And I'm not sure that my parents set out to tell me this, but one of the things that I think I drew from that is that there's a cost to following Jesus. And so when hard or difficult things happen, or when you're the only one, or when you're mocked or whatever, it's not like this big surprise. It's not like you've been sold a gospel that is, your life is going to be easy. The blessing of God means everything will always be comfortable. So like there was this expectation of adventure, but also of cost, and of, outside the faith, people might call it the pursuit of meaning, like a desire to live a meaningful life and live for what really matters. But, inside the faith, that whole longing of the human heart inside the Christian faith is also often accompanied by cost and suffering, and that those are the heroic people. And I think that really shaped me. It's interesting because I used to work with apologist and great thinker Professor John Lennox, and we would often talk about, because we worked with a lot of people who had radical conversion stories themselves, like had come to God from atheism themselves, but we were both the children of strong Christians. And he would definitely pull out the distinctive of his parents of, encouraging thoughtful questions and encouraging, the life of the mind. And also, like connection with the suffering church. That was a strand for him too. So anyway, those are a few thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I mentioned to our podcast listeners before that I've got two little girls. And so this kind of question is personal to me because they're going to grow up in a ministry home. My wife is a pastor's child herself. And so we've got this multi-generational layer of Christianity, but our children are growing up in an increasingly more hostile type of environment. And so it's great to be able to hear from leaders like yourself on what was done well from the parent point of view. One more question before we dive into Christmas. It has to do with your experience in the UK. One of the things I've experienced from leaders like yourself in the UK, or just normal Christians actually, is that their faith tends to be, from my perspective, tends to be a little bit more on fire than from our own context. South Africa is largely a Christian kind of space. I mean, just this morning when I was filling up my car at the petrol station, the attendant said, "May the Lord bless you," this morning. And that's normal to be able to hear those kind of, I'm praying for you, may the Lord bless you. That kind of experience is quite normal here in South Africa. And it's easy to kind of be comfortable in your Christianity and have almost like a cultural type of Christianity that kind of filters into your faith. Whereas in Europe and in spaces like yourself where secularism is so rife, how do you live your faith out in that space? What encouragement would you have for young leaders who are in spaces like you've grown up in?
It's kind of a difficult question to answer because obviously we don't really know anything different. We
Yeah.
kind of visit South Africa or America and think, wow, this feels really weird and it must be so much easier. But I
Yeah.
can see that there are sort of dangers in the bubble and there are real dangers in comfort. And that is true in the Christian life, isn't it? That comfort is often a sort of danger point for us. I think just connection to the Lord personally, keeping that walk with him regular and real, putting time into that. I think a sort of expectation that that God is kind of calling us to bring light in the darkness. Like we're not we're not actually called to just only live, as C.T. Studd put it, I don't want to live within the sound of the church bell. I want to go and raid hell. That sort of mindset of mandate and commission to be a light in the darkness and to try and view that as a positive rather than a negative, because obviously we can get really ground down. But at the moment we're in so-called super secular Europe and Britain, we're actually seeing a wonderful move of God, and the mainline press are following it and seeing that particularly Gen Z are awakening to God in a really exciting and wonderful way. So like those seasons of blessing come, and when you've been in the trenches and plowing up fairly hard ground, when those seasons come, it's all the more wonderful.
Well, let's dive into the topic at hand, which is Christmas. You've recently released a book on the Advent and diving into Mary's story. Why did you choose to dive into that part of the Christmas story and use it as a space for apologetics?
So the book is called Mary's Voice, and it's a book of Advent reflections. And so there are a few reasons. I think the first reason is that even in our very secular context, there is still a sort of hopeful openness around Christmas that hangs around in the culture, that is a moment for spiritual engagement. And actually that moment is really Advent. It's actually the run up to Christmas. You know, when you've got a lot of things, you've got everybody doing their shopping, and, you know, you've got this sort of the build up to Christmas. You know, once Christmas itself comes, you know, some people go to church, but really not very much, not as much. It's like in the run up. And so I was noticing that in my own evangelistic work, the opportunity to come and bring a Christmas message in major banks, in parliaments, in universities, where the vast majority of people are not followers of Jesus, but there's this opening. And then realizing that the Christmas, like the run up to the Christmas story, you know, the annunciation of the virgin birth and the prophecies of Isaiah and Micah, and, you know, the stuff around that central truth of the incarnation actually really deeply connects with that spiritual openness, if we can, you know, do that job. So that was sort of the beginning of it. And then specifically the Mary piece was that I realized, and it kind of again overlapped with something happening in the wider culture. So if you know who Tom Holland is, the historian, he wrote the book Dominion, and he's essentially, you know, best-selling book, and he's one of the hosts of one of the most famous most popular podcasts, The Rest is History. And as a kind of secular person, he realized that, you know, the Christian faith is the reason that we have everything good that we do have in the West. And he was kind of being awakened to this. And one of those things was how the church treated women. So at the same time, I was kind of noticing in the text, I think, how Luke's gospel in particular centers the perspective of women. So Luke obviously wrote his gospel based on multiple eyewitness testimonies and gathers that evidence, does that research thoroughly, and then compiles his gospel. But his primary witness, according to tradition, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I kind of realized, gosh, I've been a Christian for nearly 40 years. You know, I've read the Bible many times. I've studied the Bible. I've written a book called Why Trust the Bible. You know, I do the Bible in a year. But I've never really stopped and actually listened to Mary's voice, which is recorded for us in Luke's gospel. And I thought, okay, there's an evangelistic, but also a sort of ministering to the church opportunity here to recenter the perspective of the Christian faith's most important female witness, and to do that in a way that hopefully awakens the world and helps people engage with what she thought mattered most, which was the person of Jesus, who he was. Because Mary's voice points us always to Jesus. And there's a kind of evidential strand to this as well, which is that, you know, women's testimony in the ancient world wasn't regarded as having equal validity to a man's testimony. So the fact that we have this preserved witness by this very important woman felt like a sort of opportunity. So it was like a creative reframing, I guess, of stuff that is very familiar, but a way in. And then I realized as well, because, you know, I'm a Protestant Christian, there's a sort of fear around Mary, you know, because of, you know, what Protestants sort of say or think about Catholics, you know, worshipping Mary or praying to her, whatever. And because of that, in a way, she's been ignored. But actually there's real beauty, goodness, truth, depth in you know, looking into this. So
Yeah. All right, so let's dive into Christmas. There's so many directions we can take this conversation, But I think at the top of it, I would love to ask the question that has to do with the pagan origins of Christmas. I've heard it for years and years and years at our church, where people who refuse to come to church over the Christmas season, the Advent season, simply because we start putting lights up, and they start speaking about how this is all pagan and that has roots in the pagan traditions. So could you take a moment just to unpack some of those claims for us and how you would respond to that?
The earliest Christians didn't actually celebrate Jesus' birth. Their focus was on his death and resurrection. And of course, we know that the New Testament doesn't give us a specific date for Jesus' birth. And the early church, the patristic writers in the second and third century sort of offer various guesses, which range between March and November. So, um, like the date itself is not a kind of historic thing. But by the fourth century, the Western Church chose December the 25th as the date that we would commemorate Christ's birth. And that was a date that coincided with existing Roman festivals. And that meant that Christians could, take the time off work and be in the flow of the wider calendar of the culture they were in. So the festivals that the 25th of December coincided with were the Sol Invictus, the Unconquered Sun Festival, and Saturnalia, which were both festivals that celebrated light renewal and the sort of winter solstice. So because of that, some people say, well, Christmas is actually pagan. But that isn't how the church and how Christians have understood it. Rather than being a sort of sign of pagan compromise, this is an example of a theological reframing, because the early Christians were following Jesus, the light of the world, John 1 verse 9, or Jesus as the Son of Righteousness spoken of in Malachi 4 verse 10, who overcomes darkness. And so it was like an application of the truth of the incarnation, the truth that the light of the world has come in a kind of visible celebration that is about the birth of the Son of God. So Christmas is the time in the church calendar when we think about and celebrate the incarnation of God entering human history in Jesus. And so the earliest sort of recorded Christmas sermons are from preachers like St. Augustine, John Chrysostom, and even Leo the Great. And the focus isn't on decorations or, fairy lights or candles or whatever. It's on the mystery of God made flesh, the Word becoming flesh, and Jesus as the light of the world. And so in our cultural moment today, in a way, not dissimilarly from what the early Christians were doing, we have this moment. I mean, obviously not in every country of the world, perhaps in a more Islamic countries or whatever, but in countries where, Christmas and Santa still sort of hang around, we have an opportunity as Christians, like the early Christians did, to proclaim the incarnation of God and the birth of Christ as God with us. And so I don't think we need to fear, talking about Saturnalia or the winter solstice or anything. There's none of that is hidden. None of that is a surprise to any Christians. We're like, yeah, of course. The gospel has always been preached in a context where there will rival worldviews. The point is what you do with those rival worldviews and how you take the opportunities that they afford us to preach the true gospel. So that's how I would understand it.
So I'm curious to hear from you. You've spoken about this idea of Santa Claus and how the culture has really taken Christmas and turned it into something other than it was, let's say, in the 4th century, and very different to what we have here in as Christians. But how should we as Christians approach Santa Claus and, all the commercialized elements of Christmas? I think particularly as I think of my own children, I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. what advice would you have for us as younger parents as we raise our children up in this commercialized space? Like, we got Santa everywhere. Everyone says, "Hey, did Santa bring you a present today?" What advice would you have for someone like myself?
So I didn't always get this right. Let's put it this way. We didn't do the Santa thing with our children. So my kids, my twins are 20 now, and my youngest is 17. So they're well out of the kind of do we believe in Santa thing. But the way I approached it was to say to them, Santa was actually also a friend of Jesus. Santa is a historical person who was called Saint Nicholas. We got the map out and looked at Turkey, where it is. And there's Istanbul, and that used to be called Constantinople. And that actually used to be like a really big center for the early church. And this guy, Saint Nicholas, loved Jesus so much that to celebrate his birth, he gave kids presents and gifts, and they were often quite poor children who wouldn't, So I explained the Santa thing through the lens of Christ, but tried to refocus on Jesus. However, what one of my sons drew from that, he went into school the next day and he told all the 4-year-olds in his class, um, Father Christmas, that's what we call him here, is dead. And children were crying in the corridors,
Yeah,
and my husband got summoned to the school to be told off. So it was actually genuinely quite funny. I mean, we laugh about it now, but
yeah,
you do have to be really careful about it. So I think what I would do now is say, some people choose to celebrate Christmas through this idea of Santa, and actually he was this friend of Jesus, this Christian who lived a long time ago. But we can go along, it's a game, and people still believe in him, but he's not real, but it's a game, and you don't want to be the person who ruins the game for other people. That was the step I missed out that I would now do. But other Christians, do the Santa thing. I just didn't want my children to work out, oh, there's this imaginary figure who my parents have told me exists, and now I've grown up and I've realized he doesn't exist. I just was like, I don't want to do that, because I feel like there's I want my children to be able to trust me when I tell them things. But we still did the games, like we have stockings, but they knew it was us that filled the stockings.
yeah. I mean, I really appreciate, even though the St. Nicholas kind of example didn't quite work out for your son in the school environment. I do think it is really helpful to help the kids understand where St. Nicholas comes from and where the story kind of originated from. And I mean, it was only a few years ago that I discovered the way that we even imagine Father Christmas and Santa Claus comes from the Coca-Cola company's marketing.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a
so
very
like,
American thing, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
So to help
But
them see
also,
those
yeah,
connections.
the other thing I would say is that, Christians are often down on, oh, the commercialization of Christmas, whatever. But the reality is that, Jesus called feasting and celebrating good, and he participated in it. And I feel like, Christmas is it belongs to the church and to Christians. And if we're sort of very dreary and frugal over over Christmas, and we're not modeling a culture of celebration. We do also have Lent and fasting, and we do also have, lament and Good Friday, but actually Christmas is the moment to celebrate. So we actually pull out all the stops. And again, being in a ministry family, I think that's been really important for our children, that Christmas is a time for family. We host a lot of people, we're generous with gifts and food and wine, and they experience celebration. And if the world does celebration better than us on our own festival of Jesus' incarnation, then that's a bit sad, isn't it? That's how I feel about it. So I don't like this whole kind of It's a bit like when people turn up in church once a year and the person speaking says, well, you only come once, that's not good enough to come once a year, like tell people off. No, no, no. We need to build the bridge to the world. And Christmas is a bridge.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm hoping that it kind of encourages those of us who are wrestling with the commercialization element within our churches and our culture. I mean, even now, I know that there's Christmas music starting to be played in our shops, and the trees are going to start coming up now in November. So it's really good to chat about it. I'd love to just give a little bit more time to talk about the credibility of the Christmas story. You mentioned how you had read through Mary's story so often that you kind of miss the depth of it. And then at the same time, I realized that I'm so familiar with the Christmas story, particularly because we tell it every single year in church, that you forget how crazy the Christmas story actually is. I mean, you have a young lady who falls pregnant miraculously. I mean, if someone said that today, would probably say that she's lying. You've got Jesus coming in, God coming incarnate in human form. That's crazy. You have the star that's in the sky. You have angels singing and declaring God's praises. These are all crazy things. I would love just to give you a moment to kind of chat into the apologetic element of some of these that might stand out to you.
So I wouldn't use the word crazy, actually. I would say that all of the things that you have mentioned have a good evidence base and are amazing. And part of the job of the evangelist and the preacher at Christmas time is to communicate, yes, this is wondrous. This is kind of awesome. But if this is true, and we believe it is, and there's very good reason for believing it is, this is worthy of your attention. So that's sort of how I would go about it. Now, with the Mary and the virgin conception, I would say there's a few things that are really interesting in that account. The first is that Mary is actually in the interaction with the angel, Mary is given the opportunity to consent. And Mary pushes back. She says, how can this be since I am a virgin? In other words, Mary understands biology and where babies come from. It's not like ancient people were stupid, And the text actually includes her critical feedback. I can't be pregnant because I haven't lain with a man. In other words, the text is acknowledging that what is being talked about here, if it is true, is a miracle. And a miracle, by definition, is an intervention of the creator of the universe, into the universe. So this is not imposed on Mary. Mary, as a young woman in the ancient world, is given agency. And she says, may it be unto your servant according to your word. So even in this early text, we have consent. I find that fascinating. So there's something really interesting there, and her extraordinary faith. Then the second thing I would say is, if you are saying, I don't believe this is impossible, this is crazy, then you're kind of disagreeing with a woman's account of her own experience. I think there's an apologetic opportunity there. We can say, are you willing to listen to women? Here we have the recorded speech of a first century woman. That is actually quite rare. There aren't other texts that have the recorded speech of women. And the Bible is centering a woman's voice here. So there's all sorts of ways I think we can explore that. The other thing is that Joseph also assumes a natural reason for every pregnancy, including his girlfriend Mary's pregnancy. And it is only when he has a vision from an angel that he becomes persuaded. In other words, the worldview of the Bible isn't, Mary's pregnant, I've never slept with her, it must be a miracle. No, he immediately assumes a natural reason. And it's only when there's another supernatural intervention, a dream in this occasion, or a vision from an angel, that Joseph is also persuaded. So the text actually creates space for our skepticism. And I think, again, that's an opportunity to invite people into the worldview of the Bible, which is, yes, miracles happen, but we don't live in a sort of strange, weird world where the laws of nature don't apply. When miracles happen, they are extraordinary and they require us to question them. And, so there's all of that. Then again, when you think about the angels in the sky and the shepherds, notice how both the Matthew and the Luke accounts take into consideration what the shepherds are going to need. So the shepherds see the heavenly host and they say, the heavenly host, the angels appearing in the sky the night Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And we know exactly where this is. They say, today in the town of David, a Saviour has been born. And then they say, this will be a sign to you. Okay, now just think about that for a moment. So shepherds are working class, ordinary working men who are at work on the night shift. That's who we're talking about. These are earthy, down to earth people who are not given to flights of fancy. They've seen these angels in the sky and they are going to require more than that. So the angels say, this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths lying in a manger. Now, because we're familiar with the nativity, the Christmas card, the image, the pictures of this is now familiar. It's not a sign to us of anything because we know it, but they didn't know it. Think how strange. A newborn baby lying in an animal feeding trough. That was unusual in the ancient world, and that was the sign to them. So written within the accounts themselves are, signs and evidence. The idea that people push back and they need more, but also, yes, there is another dimension to life. There is a supernatural dimension to life. God does exist, and he wants us to know he's there, and that's what Christmas is about.
Wow, I really love how you actually use the scriptures to argue for the scriptures. I think that that took me by surprise. I kind of expected that you'd bring it out from a philosophical kind of angle, but really using the scripture to speak to itself, I think is really helpful. And as a preacher myself, I'm taking notes, and I'm sure that many preachers are taking notes here because we have to preach the story every year, and there's only so many angles that you can come. What advice or what stands out to you from the Christmas story that you think many preachers might miss on a typical Christmas service or in the Advent process? Is there anything that stands out to you?
So I think, what I've been trying to draw out, I guess, already is it's this wonderful, which is a preacher's dream in a way, combination of evidence and this idea of signs. So the New Testament sort of positioning of that Greek word semia of a sign. What a sign is something tangible that is pointing beyond itself to something really profound. And so our need as human beings, this is what epistemology is. How do we know what we know? How do we come to believe what we come to believe? And evidence and signs play a huge role in that. So I think at Christmas, whether you're drawing out, these things were specifically prophesied about hundreds of years before and then come true. That would be something we could draw out. Or that the characters within the story, whether it's Mary and the shepherds I've just mentioned, or the Magi, who were kind of Eastern, they were philosophers and astronomers, deep thinkers, who became persuaded by what they saw, the sign they saw, that this was actually true. So, really, really dwelling into how do human beings come to know what we know and believe what we believe, and then connect that with the Christmas story. But then I also think, wonder, like, this is awesome. And if we as preachers cannot communicate the awesomeness of the incarnation, we need to go home. Like if we're making the Christmas story small or sentimental or, you know, uninteresting, it ought to be sort of shocking and confronting and wondrous and intriguing. And it is. And if we can't do that, then we're not really preaching the Christmas story. I think that's how I would see it. Does that make sense?
Yes,
And
100%.
sometimes our own familiarity is the problem. It's not that the problem is not the text, and the problem is not the world that needs to be won. The problem is us.
Wow. Yeah.
So there's like a sort of and actually, you know, it particularly, I think if you're a church leader, Christmas is quite a tiring time because there's a million events. And so it may be that you need to bring in an evangelist. You know, I've got a few leader friends who bring me in to preach the big carol services because they're focused on the job of getting the church ready, getting everyone inviting people, you know, making sure the music is on, making sure that the community has been properly invited. And it may be that this is a moment you need to bring in a gifted evangelist who can do this.
Yeah, no, I think it's great advice, and I'd actually like to dive deeper into that because there is such a beautiful gospel opportunity that you've alluded to throughout this conversation of that Christmas offers us an opportunity to point people to Jesus in a way that many of our churches and ministries don't have the opportunity or space to do that throughout the year. So in your experience, why is Christmas season so effective for outreach? Because, like you said, our carol service at our church is the biggest service that we'll host in the year.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that will be true all over the world. Um, and often for those who are sort of starting out in this, often it's not actually the Christmas day itself, it's the run up, you know, which is what I mentioned. So, you know, in nearly 30 years of ministry, I would say that the most evangelistically fruitful 2.5 weeks of the year are the first 2.5 weeks of December, because people are open. They're, you know, they want to celebrate Christmas. People are kind of in the mood to say yes to invitations, so they'll come to things. Um, there's a spiritual openness, if we're honest, because Christmas is often also a time when, you know, we remember loved ones who've died. We think about our own childhood. We think about our children. So although everyone kind of says, "Oh, it's so commercial," actually, for many people, Christmas is a time that's quite painful. You know, if you've got divorce or bereavement, it all comes up at Christmas, right? If you've got childhood happy memories or sad memories, those come up for yourself. So there's a sort of openness in people, I think. And so I would just encourage people to create opportunities around it. You know, I will be speaking at Christmas events in major London banks, in universities, in churches this year, and I do that every year. And often people will pray a sinner's prayer and come to faith, or they'll decide I'm going to do Alpha or, you know, a follow on course in next term. It's like a real moment evangelistically. So yeah, I would encourage you to sort of think about that and be ready to even yourself invite all your neighbors over for, you know, a little party and have a sort of 5-minute Christmas thought that you've prepared that you can give, that maybe then invites people to church, or, you know, gives people a book or something as well. You know, encourage everyone to do something like that at their work, everyone in your church. If everyone did that in their job, thousands of people would hear the gospel. You know, it's such a time of opportunity.
And I think to add to what you're saying, that the one thing that stood out to me was that you're getting invited by workplaces to share the gospel in the workplace. And perhaps there's workplace people listening who own businesses or have influence. perhaps that's an opportunity. Maybe you can create a space for an evangelist or a preacher to come in and share the gospel during this
Yeah,
season.
you do. You have a few carols, have some drinks, and call it, the the company Christmas carols, and you get a preacher. Make sure it's short. I never do more than 12 minutes, and sometimes do more like 5 or 7, and depending on the vibe of the event. But yeah, prepare something that is really Christmassy, really focused on what the meaning of Christmas is, but actually preaches the incarnation.
Amy, this has been such a great time with you. I think we can keep going for much longer, but we're going to have to bring this interview to a close. For those who are listening and want to connect with you or connect with your work or find your book on Mary's Voice, where can they go? Where can you point them?
Sure. So this is my book, Mary's Voice. It's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books from. I have a website which is just www.amyorr-ewing.com. My ministry website is advocate-collective.org. People can find my apologetics material on YouTube. I've just in the process of releasing a series on God and suffering that people can do in groups. It's like 8-part series, sort of half an hour talks on that. I've got a new book coming out in 2026, which is called Forgiveness: Reclaiming Its Power in a Culture of Outrage and Fear. And if people wanted to support me, they could pre-order that book. That would be great. You know what it's like. I'm in that push for pre-orders at the moment. But yeah, those are a few places to connect further.
Wonderful. And perhaps even some of those books, even Forgiveness, could be a Christmas present that you
Yeah,
could
it's not out yet though. Next year it could be. It's out.
pre-order it for a friend.
Pre-order it.
Avi, as we close, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave with our listeners?
I guess just to encourage us to keep going and to stay faithful. One of the things that can happen when Christmas comes around again, if you've been in ministry for a long time, is it's like just another thing to get through and a lot to organize. And so to encourage you, and that's one of the heart behind Mary's Voice, is also for that personal wonder to return and that deeper connection to God through that Advent season. So just praying for leaders and Christians on this podcast, that this Christmas in 2025, that we would be walking really closely with Jesus, and that all our work and outreach would be an overflow of that intimacy and connection with him.
That's so beautiful. Amy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. Has really added value to me, and I'm going to be sharing this interview with the pastors in my church as well as they lead up to Christmas. Could I ask that you close us off in prayer, just that you could pray for those leaders as we head into the Christmas season?
Yeah. So Lord, we just thank you for the birth of Jesus in history. We thank you that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we thank you for that word from John. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And Lord, I pray for every leader and every Christian with us right now, just listening or watching this podcast. I pray that you would just deeply encourage us, that you would fill us with your Holy Spirit, that we would be those who work from that overflow of seeing your glory, not in our own strength, not trying to muster anything up or stir anything up, but those who love you and who live in the overflow of the love of God for us and of the glory of Jesus. So we pray for really fruitful Christmas for all the ministries represented here in churches. And we pray that you would keep us faithful, walking with you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Amy.
Not at all. Thanks for having me on.